Part 37. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 361. Chen Tao thought. Pei Ai plans to liberate the sanctuary. Also, Pei Ai was born and raised in the sanctuary, and the sanctuary is like this. It is obviously embarrassing for Pei Ai to give up the sanctuary and leave. Unless, Pei Ai is an emotionless person, it is impossible for her to leave like this. Chen Tao also understood. Chen Tao said, "Okay, I promise you to help you liberate the sanctuary." Pei Ai was slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao. "Really?" Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "It's boring to have nothing to do now anyway. Chen Tao is the king of this dragon, the king of this universe, according to the dragon's law of balance. Now that the civilization of this world encounters such a thing, he can choose to intervene. When a civilization is in crisis, the dragon people can guide and help. This is how the dragon people civilization handles it. Of course it is possible for Chen Tao to liberate the sanctuary." Pei Ai was happy. She raised her face, approached Chen Tao, and kissed Chen Tao. Parted lips. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's face, saw her eyelashes trembling slightly, and watched her slowly open her big eyes filled with moisture. Looking into her eyes, Chen Tao smiled. Suddenly. Bang. Suddenly there was a muffled sound at the door. The door was kicked open. In an instant, 5 warriors wearing light mechas rushed in from outside and rushed in. A group of people directly held the firearms in their hands, surrounded Chen Tao and Pei Ai, and pointed their guns at Chen Tao and Pei Ai. At this time, one of the blond men walked in from outside the door. With a playful smile on his face, he looked at the two of them and said, "They are quite close." Seeing the person coming, Pei Ai frowned. "Gensi, what do you want to do?" The person who came was none other than Gen Si, the deputy head of the law enforcement team. Gensi crossed his arms and looked at the two of them. He squinted his eyes and said lightly, "What do I want to do? Don't you know?" Gensi's eyes fell on Chen Tao, and he said, "It is obvious that the owner of the technology can save all mankind, but he is unwilling to hand it over." If you don't hand it over, then I will have a way to make you hand it over." "Is this the commander's intention? Or is it Jenna's intention?" Pei Ai stood up and blocked Chen Tao behind him. Gensi narrowed his eyes and said, "The old guy commander doesn't listen to me at all, but that doesn't matter. When I catch him, I will pry his mouth open and let him spit out the secrets of technology. When the time comes, I don't believe it, he still doesn't recognize me." Pei Ai frowned. "In other words, is this what you mean?" "Yes." Gensi smiled slightly and said, "That's what I meant." Pei Ai frowned. She looked at the firearms and thought to herself, she must find an opportunity to call the mecha over. "Don't move." Gen Si stared at Pei Ai playfully and said, "I know your mechas can fly over from a distance for assembly, but if you dare to move, I believe my people can easily assemble them on the machine. Before it can be assembled, it will kill you." Pei Ai frowned. Gensi is already prepared. "This is troublesome." Gensi said, "You two turn around, hold your heads in your hands, lean against the wall, hurry up." At this time, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he took a step forward, keeping Pei Ai behind him. Seeing Chen Tao's actions, Gensi frowned. "Don't move. If you move again, I'll shoot." He pulled out his pistol, pulled the safety, and pointed the gun at Chen Tao. He said, "What I want is your technology, as long as you can speak. As for breaking 1 or 2 of your limbs, it doesn't matter to me. I believe you don't want your hands and feet to be broken either, right?" "Threat?" Chen Tao looked at Gen Si. He crossed his arms across his chest, looked at Gen Si and said, "Didn't Demantia tell you about what happened in the orchard?" When Pei Ai heard this, she seemed to remember something. Her eyes lit up slightly. "By the way, She had seen before that Chen Tao could turn a fruit tree into oblivion in an instant. Does this mean that Chen Tao could also use a few tricks to deal with Gen Si? Gen Si tilted his head and squinted his eyes, staring at Chen Tao and said, "Dimanche said something about your mecha and unlimited energy. What's wrong?" Chen Tao said, "Well, that is to say, she didn't tell you about that matter. Then let me tell you." Chen Tao looked at Gen Si and said, "There were hundreds of monsters in that orchard. When Dimanche knew about the situation, she chose to retreat. After that, I dealt with those monsters. You know what methods I used to deal with those monsters?" Gensi's pupils trembled slightly, and there was a hint of uneasiness in his eyes. He calmed down and said, "What do you mean? Didn't you and Pei Ai use the mecha to deal with it?" Chen Tao shrugged and said, "There are hundreds of monsters. We only have so much time, and it's difficult to clear hundreds of monsters in a short time while wearing a mecha." Gen Si frowned. Chen Tao said, "Then let me show you now how I disposed of them. You can look at your sides." When Gensi heard this, he frowned. "I advise you, don't play any tricks, otherwise you will be the one who will die if the gun is pointed at you." As he said that, he looked around. At first glance, nothing happened. Gensi's eyebrows slightly stretched, and he thought to himself, "This guy Chen Tao seems to be scaring himself. No, wait a minute." Gensi's pupils narrowed slightly and he looked around. What happened? Gensi was suddenly shocked to find that the mecha warriors around him were gone. The people he brought just now were still here in the last second, but now they are all gone. Incomprehensible. Gensi looked at Chen Tao, his face turned pale. He stared at Chen Tao and said, What did you do? Where are my people?" Chen Tao looked at Gensi and smiled. "I said, I am showing you how I deal with those monsters. It is much easier to deal with your people than those monsters. Your data is too simple, and it only takes a thought to erase it." He crossed his arms. Gensi's face was as pale as paper. He stared at Chen Tao. You guy." He pulled the trigger of the pistol in his hand. Bang! A bullet shot at Chen Tao. Chen Tao raised his hand and clenched it. Gensi was stunned, his pupils trembling as he watched the scene in front of him. Chen Tao slowly opened his hand, and a bullet that was twisted by the pinch fell from Chen Tao's hand and fell to the ground with a slight sound. Seeing this, Gensi's pupils widened, and he looked at Chen Tao. "You are a monster. You are a monster," he shouted and was about to continue to pull the trigger. Suddenly, the pistol in Gensi's hand disappeared, just like that. Gensi's pupils shrank, he subconsciously took a step back, and fell to the ground. Chen Tao looked at Gensi's panic, and said, "Are you scared? When you came in, I saw that you were not afraid at all. Now you are scared, but it's too late." The words fell. Gensi was stunned, and he looked, but found that his body was turning into sand at a speed visible to the naked eye. "Ah! Ah!" Gensi screamed. The body turned into sand at a speed visible to the naked eye. When the wind blew, the sand turned into powder and dissipated in the air. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 362. Watching Gen Si turn into sand and dissipate, Pei Ai slowly looked away and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, "Let's go see your commander." As he spoke, he raised his hand and opened a black wormhole. "What are you going to see the commander for?" Pei Ai suddenly said. Pei Ai was a little nervous for a moment. Chen Tao was attacked by Gen Si. He just wiped out Gen Si, but now he still has to go find the commander. Does he want to attack the commander? As a person born in the Holy Realm, Pei Ai couldn't accept this. She had to ask Chen Tao clearly what he meant first. Chen Tian looked at Pei Ai. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao and said, "Gensi's attack was not the commander's intention, but his personal intention. This matter has nothing to do with the commander. If, You want to settle accounts with the commander. I don't think it is right good. After hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile and said, don't worry, I'm just looking for your commander to reflect on Gen C's matter. Otherwise, it wouldn't be good if a person dies here and I remain indifferent. Pei Ai was slightly startled, her eyes glowed with luster, she pursed her thin lips and said, well, that's okay. Chen Tao took back time and stepped into the micro-wormhole. When he reappeared, he appeared next to Leslie as the commander of the sanctuary. Leslie was standing on the balcony of a high-rise building, looking at the scenery in the distance. When Chen Tao came out of the micro-wormhole, he also noticed this side. Watching Chen Tao come out, Leslie held his goatee, looked at Chen Tao, and said with a smile, what kind of technology is this? It feels very convenient. Chen Tao looked around and found that Leslie was the only one here. He had often seen Leslie with several mecha warriors in the past. And this time it was just Leslie. It is estimated that this place is Leslie's private residence, and he doesn't want to be disturbed by others, so he is alone. Chen Tao was too lazy to think about it. He looked at Leslie and said, I just encountered something. You are responsible for it in the sanctuary, so I came to find you. Leslie held his goatee in his hand, looked at Chen Tao and said, something happened. What happened? Chen Tao folded his hands on his chest, looked at Leslie, and said, that guy named Gen Si came to find me and sent a team of people to surround me. He said he wanted to arrest me and pry it out of my mouth. What he wants to know. Upon hearing this, Leslie was slightly startled, and his face darkened slightly. I have warned that guy before, but I didn't expect that guy to act without permission. Leslie frowned and looked at Chen Tao, where is he now? Chen Tao said, kill. Leslie was startled, his old face changed slightly, his eyebrows furrowed tightly, looking very ugly. Noticing Leslie's expression, Chen Tao stretched his eyebrows slightly and said, aren't you going to show off about this matter? Leslie was slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao, performance. Chen Tao crossed his arms and looked at Leslie, your man pointed a gun at me. Is this the only explanation you have now? Leslie looked a little ugly. He held his beard tightly with his hand and looked at Chen Tao. This matter is his personal intention, and now he has received the punishment he deserves. Leslie looked at Chen Tao, do you want anything else? Chen Tao said, if you can't control the people under you, then I can think that if the mecha is handed over to you, you can't control the people under you. Then when my mecha is in your hands, won't it directly become the murder weapon? When Pei Ai heard this, she subconsciously looked at Chen Tao. She wanted to say something, but she closed her mouth. Pei Ai still knows her identity now. She is now Chen Tao's woman and belongs to Chen Tao. But now facing the issue between Chen Tao and the sanctuary commander, she felt that she should stand on Chen Tao's side, so she didn't speak. Leslie frowned and looked at Chen Tao, I apologize to you for what happened before. I promise that these things will never happen again. Chen Tao said, apologizing is not enough. He looked at Leslie and said, I planned to give you 6 mechas before. This incident made me feel very bad, so the number was reduced, leaving 3. Leslie was startled, this. His old face was a little panicked. Chen Tao said, that's it? With that said, Chen Tao opened a wormhole and entered the wormhole. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao's back, then looked at Leslie, then gave a slight salute, and left with Chen Tao. Leslie looked at the closed miniature wormhole, and Leslie's face became very ugly. He sat weakly on the chair, his face turned pale. Gensi, who are you messing with? Why are you messing with him? Are you so stupid, so ignorant? He covered his face with his hands, tears overflowing from the corners of his eyes. A painful look. At the same time, Chen Tao and Pei Ai left together. Pei Ai looked at Chen Tao's back and said, didn't you promise me that you would help me liberate the sanctuary? But, There are only 3 mechas left for the sanctuary. In this case, it will be very difficult to liberate the sanctuary. Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai subconsciously. He approached Pei Ai, gently held her waist with his hands, gently picked up her hair with his big hands, put it behind her ears, and then held her little cheek. Looking into her eyes, he got close to Pei Ai's face and made eye contact. Pei Ai's eyes were filled with mist. Tao. Chen Tao approached Pei Ai, his forehead touching hers, and he said softly, "Believe me, I have my own ideas. I promise I will liberate the Holy Land. Not only physically, but also spiritually." Pei Ai's eyes were filled with mist, and her big eyes looked at Chen Tao with a little mist. Chen Tao leaned down and kissed Pei Ai. Then he picked her up horizontally and walked to the bed. Pei Ai's face was as red as clouds. An hour later, Chen Tao stood by the bed and put on his clothes. After he put on his clothes, he subconsciously looked at Pei Ai on the bed. Pei Ai was lying on her side on the bed like a kitten, with her eyes closed, and she looked like she was sleeping soundly. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled. He opened a micro wormhole, stepped into the micro wormhole and left. It was already night. After nightfall, Jenna, the head of the law enforcement group, had just finished taking a shower. She was lying on the bed in a thin pajamas, looking at the ceiling. A lot of things happened in the past 2 days, and the most important thing at the moment is the appearance of that man. Thinking of Chen Tao, Jenna frowned. The appearance of that guy will affect the development of the entire Holy Land. Jenna is completely sure of this. What should I do? Jenna was thinking. Just as Jenna was thinking, suddenly, she noticed a dark round door next to her. Seeing this round door, Jenna's pupils condensed slightly, and she hurriedly got out of bed, took out a pistol from the cabinet, and aimed at the round door. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 363. Chen Tao's figure appeared in front of the miniature wormhole. As soon as he came out, he saw Jenna pointing a gun at him. Chen Tao was not interested in the pistol held by Jenna, but the scenery in front of him made him somewhat interested. Jenna is the leader of the law enforcement group, and her status in this sanctuary is second only to the commander. She is on an equal footing with Damantha from the resource group. No one dares to break into her room without her permission. Therefore, Jenna usually dresses casually in her room after work. Now Jenna had just finished taking a shower, and she was even more casually dressed, just wearing a white shirt. The thin white shirt fit Jungna's figure. There's nothing to say about Jenna's figure, her waist is so thin. The upper shirt is held up high, which is very proud. The legs are fair and slender, and a little strong at the same time. The length is estimated to be 1.5 meters. She is tall and has skin as fair as cream. Blonde hair and blue eyes, paired with that beautiful face, she is very beautiful. It can be said to be absolutely beautiful. Even Pei Ai can't compare to her figure. Jenna frowned, holding the collar of her shirt with one hand, turning slightly sideways, as if intending to hide something that could not be seen by others. She said, "What did you want to do when you suddenly broke into my room?" Her eyebrows were furrowed, and her somewhat neutral voice was serious and dignified. Chen Tao said, "It's not a good thing for girls to play with guns." He raised his hand and there was a pistol in his hand. He looked at Jenna and said, "This gun is confiscated." Jenna was stunned. She looked at her hand, but found that the pistol in her hand was gone. Seeing this, Jenna's face changed slightly, and she ran out the door in panic. It seems that he is planning to escape from here. She ran to the door, grabbed the door handle, and pulled out. But no matter how she used it, the door seemed to be welded shut and wouldn't move. Chen Tao did not stop Jenna, but quietly watched Jenna's every move. From the angle Chen Tao was looking at now, he could easily see Jenna's back. Zhen Na is tall and has an proud figure, with clear curves under the fit of her shirt. Seeing that the door could not be opened, Jenna raised her fist and slammed the door, making a banging sound. Jenna shouted, "Where are the people? Where are the guards outside? Come in, help!" she yelled. But there was no reaction at all from the outside. Jenna suddenly turned around and looked at Chen Tao. "What did you do?" For a moment, Jenna panicked. How is it possible? Jenna couldn't understand. There can be many guards outside Jenna's room, responsible for protecting her safety. But now the door couldn't be opened. She made such a big noise, and the guards outside didn't come in either. What the hell is going on? Hearing this, Chen Tao crossed his hands on his chest, looked at Jenna, and said, "I programmed your door so that it is connected to the wall, and at the same time restricted the sound in this room. The sound in this room cannot be heard outside." Of. Jenna frowned. "What exactly do you want to do?" Jenna held her collar tightly with one hand, her cheeks were a little red from excitement or fear. Jenna is nervous and uneasy now. In Jenna's opinion, the man in front of her was not a good person at all. Although he helped Sanctuary, the price was pay. Moreover, Jenna also heard that this man had already done that to pay on the first day. This man is an absolute beast, and now such a beast has come to her room inexplicably. His purpose is definitely not pure. And Jenna knew that she was no match for this man, if such a bastard man wanted to do anything to her. She couldn't resist at all. Chen Tao looked at Jenna and said with a smile, "What do you want to do?" His eyes fell on Jenna's enchanting figure, and he said, "In this late night, a man and a woman are alone in the same room. I think as long as you are a man, I don't think there will be a second choice." Jenna's whole body froze slightly, her face turned red as a blush, and she said, "How dare you?" She looked a little flustered and uneasy. "You guessed it?" Jenna hated that she was so smart that she actually guessed it right. This bastard. He actually planned to do that kind of thing. Chen Tao looked at Jenna and said, "Do you think I dare?" Jenna's face turned slightly pale. No, you let me go, and we can discuss everything." Realizing that she was no match for this man, and knowing that if she snatched it away, she would definitely be attacked by this man, Jenna just chose to take a step back. "Can we discuss it?" Chen Tao looked at Jenna and said with a smile, "We can discuss how many children we want to have." Jenna's pupils condensed. "You, don't even think about it," she was furious. Seeing Zhen Na's angry face, Chen Tao couldn't help but laugh. "Looking at you like this, you don't seem to know Jensi's actions." Chen Tao sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Jenna. Jenna was slightly startled, and she frowned. "What did you say?" "Jensi. What happened to him?" Chen Tao looked at Jenna and it seemed that she was not pretending. Chen Tao came here to find Zhen Na for several purposes, and one of them was to confirm whether Jensi Le's attack on Chen Tao was also directed by Zhen Na. Now it seems that Chen Tao can be sure that it is not the case. Jenna's demeanor was not just an act. Chen Tao said, "He attacked me and I killed him." "Kill?" Jenna was shocked. She frowned and stared at Chen Tao. "You actually killed him? Do you know who he is?" Chen Tao noticed that Jenna's face was a little ugly. He stretched his eyebrows slightly and said, "Who? Isn't he the deputy leader of the law enforcement team?" "He shouldn't have this identity," Jenna said. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he said, "Could it be, that he's your sweetheart?" Jenna was startled, and then she said, "I represent the law of the sanctuary. I am the leader of the law enforcement team. The law of the sanctuary is my life. I am not like you, betraying the law and engaging in male-female relations." Chen Tao said, "Then you care about him so much?" Jenna said, "I don't care about him, it's just, if you kill him, then what you will face will be the commander's wrath. Gensi is the commander's son. Speaking of this, Jenna's voice became a little more solemn. Chen Tao blinked and lay down lazily on Jenna's bed. As soon as he lay down, Chen Tao could still smell a faint fragrance, which was Jenna's body fragrance. He said, "Son? I remember that in the laws of the sanctuary, there is no father-son relationship allowed." Jenna's eyebrows relaxed slightly, she bit her thin lip, turned slightly and looked to the side. Indeed, they did not mention this relationship. Chen Tao looked at Jenna's back, his eyebrows slightly stretched, and said, "Although I haven't mentioned it before, are your commanders still using their power to seek a position of power for guys like Gensi?" Jenna remained silent, which was no different from acquiescence. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 364. Chen Tao never expected that Gen Si would be the commander's son. Chen Tao thought about Leslie's reaction, and his eyebrows relaxed slightly. Thanks to Leslie, when he heard that his son was killed by Chen Tao, he could still think about the problem from the perspective of the sanctuary instead of being directly angry. Chen Tao looked at the ceiling and said, "Jenna, let me tell you, if viruses and monsters are no longer a threat to humans in this world and the laws of the sanctuary also change, what will you do?" Jenna said, "I am a warrior of management laws. It is the commander's job to give orders. I will do whatever he tells me to do." Chen Tao turned his head and looked at Jenna. This woman's management rules can be said to be ruthless. Just like the punishment tyrant established, as long as others violate the punishment, she will punish them, extremely severe punishments. Even Chen Tao couldn't stand the cruelty of the punishment. It can only be said that Jenna is too cold and inhumane. But as a law enforcer, isn't it a little bad to use human nature to deal with the law? Chen Tao is not sure. Although Chen Tao is the king of dragons, in the final analysis, he is not a qualified leader. He is not clear about law management. Moreover, dragon people actually don't need much management. Those female dragons are too beautiful and kind. Chen Tao stood up and got off the bed. He looked at Jenna, who was facing him sideways, and said, "I plan to liberate the sanctuary so that humans will no longer cower in this ghost place." He looked at Jenna and said, "How about it? Are you willing to help me change the world?" Jenna was stunned for a moment. She frowned and looked at Chen Tao. "Liberating the Holy Land, what do you mean? Do you want to rebel? You still want me to betray the holy domain and join you?" Jenna stared at Chen Tao. Chen Tao crossed his arms across his chest. He looked at Jenna and said with a smile, "It's not a rebellion, it's just about returning the world to the right path. The laws in the sanctuary are too contrary to nature." Jenna frowned and said, "The laws of the sanctuary are to ensure the survival probability of mankind and allow mankind to continue. If this law was not used, mankind would have been extinct long ago. As a person from outside the territory, what do you know?" Jenna said, "Even if you kill me, I can't betray the sanctuary." She looked at Chen Tao firmly. Chen Tao blinked. "She is so determined." Chen Tao said, "Then, let me ask you in another way. If there were no viruses and no monsters at this time, humans would not need to all stay in the sanctuary and could go outside freely. At that time, we would not be afraid of resource shortages. Then humans can reproduce freely." He looked at Jenna and said, "After that, the laws of the sanctuary will have no meaning. Will you still stick to the laws of the sanctuary?" Jenna was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao. "I don't believe that there are viruses, monsters, etc. outside the sanctuary. If those things are to be eliminated, it will take many generations of efforts." Chen Tao looked at Jenna, smiled and said, "If I told you that I can get rid of those viruses and monsters, would you believe it?" Jenna was stunned. She looked at Chen Tao, her eyebrows slightly wrinkled. "You?" She looked at Chen Tao and then her eyes fell on Chen Tao. "You do have some special technology, but those monsters now fill the world, and those viruses also live in various living organisms. As long as they are touched, they may be infected. Can you clear it all by yourself? Chen Tao looked at Jenna and said, "Don't believe it." Jenna crossed her arms and shook her head. Chen Tao said, "Okay, let's make a bet." Jenna looked at Chen Tao, "Bet? What are you betting on?" Chen Tao's eyes fell on Jenna's beautiful figure. Zhen Na blushed slightly and turned slightly sideways, not looking at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said with a playful smile, "As we talked about before, if I do it, let's talk about how many children you want to give me." Jenna was startled and her face turned red. She glared at Chen Tao fiercely, bit her thin lip and said, "Okay. Okay." Chen Tao was startled, he thought it was just a joke. Jenna had such a perfect figure, Chen Tao couldn't help but want to tease her, but Chen Tao didn't expect that Jenna would agree. Jenna looked at Chen Tao, "How humans can continue to exist is the wish of all of us in the sanctuary. If you can really eliminate the virus and monsters, then what does it mean if I sacrifice some?" Jenna looked at Chen Tao seriously with her moving eyes, "If you can really do it, then I will give you as many children as you want. Compared to the continuation and survival of all mankind, this is just a small matter." Hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but take another look at Jenna. The fact that Zhen Na still had such awareness made Chen Tao look at her with admiration. Chen Tao looked at Jenna and said with a smile, "Okay, how about we give birth to 12 children when the time comes?" This woman was so rigid, it was just a good time to tease her. He just wanted to see how this iceberg-like woman blushed. Jenna was startled, her face turned slightly red, and she said, "It's up to you, but the premise is that you have to do it." Chen Tao smiled. Chen Tao said, "One word is settled." "Well, it's a deal." Jenna looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao nodded slightly, turned around, raised his hand, and opened a miniature wormhole. He stepped into the micro wormhole and left. Looking at the slowly disappearing micro wormhole, Jenna slowly sat on the edge of the bed and adjusted her mentality. "Eliminate monsters and viruses, eliminate monsters and viruses around the world," Jenna said. How could he do it? Jenna's eyes were shining. If he really did it, then I have to give him 12 children, 12. Her face flushed. She shook her head. He lay on the bed, looking at the ceiling, and said, "Impossible, he can't do it." On the other side, Chen Tao's figure appeared in a room. The lights in the room had been turned off, but there was moonlight outside, which fell from the window and fell on the bed. Chen Tao looked at the bed, where a woman was lying. The woman was wearing a thin gauze, lying on her side, with her eyes closed, sleeping soundly. She had a perfect figure, and with her long golden hair, she looked even more beautiful. This woman was the leader of the resource group, Demantia. Seeing Demansa, Chen Tao slowly walked over and looked at Demansa's beautiful face. He raised his hand and touched her cheek. At the touch, Demansa's eyes suddenly opened. She touched the short knife on the bedside table, sat up quickly and stepped back, staring at Chen Tao, who? My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 365. Look at Taimanza's reaction. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, he smiled and said, "Good evening, Captain Demantia." When Demantia heard this, she looked at Chen Tao and said, "It's you." Her solemn and tense expression slowly relaxed. She put the short knife in her hand on the bedside table and sat on the bedside, minding her own business. Folded his hands on his chest, and looked at Chen Tao. She said, "Why are you here at my place if you are not with Pai in the middle of the night?" Hearing this, Chen Tao said, "Isn't the purpose of looking for a woman in the middle of the night obvious?" He said this subconsciously. Frankly speaking, the purpose of Chen Tao coming to Demantia was to discuss the liberation of the sanctuary. Just seeing this enchanting blonde beauty, Chen Tao subconsciously planned to tease her. He wanted to see Timanza blushing and nervous. Dimancha blinked her eyes, and a smile appeared on her face. Instead of being angry or shy, she smiled. She looked at Chentao with a smile on her face and said, "Do you want me?" Chentao was silent for a moment and looked at Dimancha. Strangely, Dimancha did not show the posture that Chentao imagined, but instead smiled, as if she asked such a question indifferently. Chentao looked at Dimancha and said, "Aren't you afraid?" Dimancha blinked her eyes, looked at Chentao, and said, "Although I have never been to the Gene Exchange Center and have no experience, in any case, I am also the leader of the law enforcement team, and I have seen a lot of things. I have always been. How can a person who is on the verge of life and death be afraid of such a thing?" As Timanza said, she got off the bed, walked to the cabinet above, opened the cabinet, and took out a bottle of red wine from inside. Chentao looked at Dimancha's figure. Dimancha was wearing a thin lace gauze skirt that fit her concave figure perfectly. Her waist was so thin and her legs were so straight and slender. She has a flawless figure. Her long hair naturally fell behind her like a golden waterfall, ending abruptly at her waist. Her skin is as fair as ice, and her face is delicate and mature. Dimancha handed Chentao a wine glass while minding her own business. Chentao took it subconsciously. Dimancha picked up the wine bottle, poured a glass of wine for Chentao, and also poured a glass of wine for herself. She sat down next to Chentao and put the wine bottle on the bedside table. He held the wine glass and crossed his legs. She looked at the wine glass in her hand, a smile appeared on her face, and she subconsciously looked at Chentao. Just met Chentao's gaze. Chentao looked into Dimancha's eyes. Timanza smiled slightly, raised her glass, and took a sip of wine. She looked at Chentao and said with a smile, "What? You don't like the wine I poured for you?" Hearing this, Chentao looked at the red wine in his hand, and the aroma of wine came from the red wine. But the aroma of the wine was not as fragrant as the beauty next to me. Chentao took the wine glass and took a sip. The entrance is a little astringent, which is within Chentao's acceptance range. Chentao's identity is very ordinary, so he doesn't understand wine, but he can still drink a little. Just took a sip. Chentao felt a slight warmth on his shoulders. He came back to his senses and looked sideways, only to find Timanza's little head resting on his shoulder. Seeing this, Chentao was slightly startled. Timanza rested her little head on Chentao's shoulder, and looked at the wine glass in her hand. She said, "As a woman, in this holy land, you must go to the Gene Exchange Center. Carrying out breeding tasks is our daily responsibility. A woman's duty. Although as the head of the law enforcement group, I have the privilege to freely choose the time to take the Gene Exchange Center, but after I reach the age of 30, I will not be allowed to perform breeding tasks no matter what my status is. I want to experience it while I'm still young," Dimantha said. She looked at Chentao and said with a smile, "I heard that bullets can't penetrate your body. Your body is very special. I want to know how special it is." She raised her face slightly and looked at Chentao's face. Their faces were very close. Eyes facing each other. The corners of her mouth raised slightly, and she slowly moved closer to Chentao. One kiss, lips parted. Dimancha's eyes were filled with confusion. Looking at Timanza's expression, smelling her body fragrance so close at hand. Chentao's mind became active. He withdrew his gaze, stood up, and picked up the wine glass in Dimancha's hand. Dimancha was slightly startled and looked at Chentao. Chentao put the two wine glasses in his hands on the cabinet, turned around and looked at Dimancha. There was a smile on Timantha's face. Chentao approached Dimancha. Dimancha lay down and looked at Chentao with her big eyes. Eyes facing each other. Dimancha's eyes were filled with moisture, and her cheeks also had a rare blush. She looked at Chentao and said, "Wait a minute." Chentao looked at Dimancha. Dimanche blushed, looked at Chen Tao, and said, Pei, I followed you, and she changed into 6 mechas. What about me? Can I get anything? Upon hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, you and Pei are different. Pei is an exchange, but you are voluntary. So, there is nothing. Dimantha was startled, and she said, then am I cheap? This is not acceptable. She is unhappy. Chen Tao smiled, not cheap at all. No, Dimantha pretended to be angry and said, if you don't give me some compensation, don't even think about it. Chen Tao lowered his face and blocked her voice. For a long time, Dimanche has had a very confusing question. Sometimes she would ask herself in the dead of night. What is she living for? For the sanctuary? In fact, Dimanche was born and raised in the sanctuary, but Dimanche's feelings for the sanctuary are very dull. The reason why Dimanche became the head of the resource group is because the commander saw her outstanding leadership and command ability. For Dimanche, collecting resources and commanding the resource group is just a job. For a long time, Dimanche felt that she was like a machine that produced mechas, and every day she worked except for work. Sometimes, she would stand alone on the balcony, looking at the night sky and asking herself, is there only work left for me to live? Is the meaning of my life just for work? Later, Dimanche thought about it. Yes, the sanctuary is a large factory, and people are just machines living in this factory, running every day for the sanctuary, nothing more. Very boring. Sometimes, the more Dimanche thought about it, the more desperate she would feel. She even had the urge to jump off the balcony. Because she found that her life had no meaning at all, and every day was boring and tedious. Recalling everything she had done before, Dimanche slowly opened her eyes. As soon as she opened her eyes, Dimanche felt the light outside the window. It was already morning. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw the man lying next to her. Seeing the man in front of her, seeing the sleeping face of this man, Dimanche's eyes were shining, and she thought of the scenes at night. Her face flushed, and she slowly leaned into Chen Tao's arms. Is the meaning of my life until now just to wait for you? Dimanche muttered to herself, with a smile on her face. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 366. Timanza looked at the man next to her, and her heart warmed when she thought of what happened last night. This man is so gentle to her. Thinking about it, Dimanche slowly approached Chen Tao and hid her body in Chen Tao's arms. Baby Chen Tao's voice sounded. Hearing this voice, Dimanza was slightly startled. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. She found Chen Tao looking at her with a gentle smile on his face. Meeting Chen Tao's gaze, Dimanche blushed slightly, looked away, leaned her little head on Chen Tao's chest, and said, who is your baby? I can't even tell you, but look what you did. Bullying people, who is your treasure? Chen Tao smiled and said, you were very happy when I called you baby last night. You're talking nonsense, I'm not happy. Dimanche blushed. Seeing Timanza blushing and unwilling to admit it, Chen Tao smiled and said, well, let's not talk about this. Let's talk about other things. Chen Tao said, as the leader of the resource group, what is your biggest wish? Wish? Dimanza raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, thought for a moment, and said, I have many wishes. Timanza said, if we want to say the biggest wish, it is to make the world's monsters and viruses disappear. However, this wish may not be realized for hundreds of years. As she said that, Dimanche looked at Chen Tao and said, if all the monsters and viruses in the world disappear, human beings can live outside the sanctuary without being afraid of resource shortages or being unable to survive. In this way, they can reproduce freely without the need for what's the breeding plan. She looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes and said, in this way, you don't have to worry about other people knowing about the things you and I do. Dimansha had a cheerful smile on her face. She raised her hand and naughtily slid her slender fingers across Chen Tao's face. Her movements were a little naughty. Chen Tao raised his hand and held Dimansha's hand. Timanza smiled and said, your hands are really big, so when you ask this question, what do you want to do? Do you want to help me and realize my wish? Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, if I realize your wish, how are you going to repay me? Timanza's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. She showed a playful smile and said, you mean, how many monsters do you want to help me kill and eliminate the virus from the world? Yet Chen Tao looked at Dimansha and said with a smile, I'm talking about what if. Dimansha pursed her thin lips, looked at Chen Tao, and said with a playful smile, if you can really do it, then I will repay you how you want me to repay you. She turned over and lay on Chen Tao's chest. She raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said with a smile, how is it? Chen Tao smiled and said, are you sure? Timensa smiled slightly and said, Timensa, speak the truth. Okay, Chen Tao said, look above. Above. Timanza turned over and looked upward. Upon entering, Dimansha's eyes glowed with a hint of luster, and a 3D sphere was suspended above. You can see clouds, green trees, and rivers from this sphere, and it looks like a mini planet. In addition to those natural things, a red patch of red can now be seen on the mini planet covering half of the planet. Seeing this, Dimansa looked at Chen Tao and said, what is that? Chen Tao said with a smile, that is a three-dimensional map of this planet. The red color you see is the area covered by those monsters and viruses. Dimansha looked at Chen Tao and said, why do you want me to see this? Chen Tao said, look at this again. With that said, Chen Tao raised his hand. There was an additional picture in the room. Through that picture, Dimansa could see a group of light beasts lying lazily on the grassland, with their eyes closed, looking at ease. This amount? Dimansha's face turned slightly pale, is this, so much? The scene in front of me is in an unknown grassland. And in this grassland, there are thousands of light beasts gathered together, densely packed, staying in the grassland. No matter who in the sanctuary sees this scene, they will feel this despair. This is the most despairing thing. Dimansha looked at Chen Tao, where did this picture come from? Chen Tao said, I built a mini satellite. Using it, I can see all the pictures of your planet. Dimantha frowned and stared at the scene in front of her. There must be at least more than 6,000 thunder beasts. Dimansha's face turned pale. Chen Tao said, there are 13,235. Dimansha was startled and looked at Chen Tao, how do you know? Chen Tao smiled and said, I have a computer that can help me calculate their number. Computer, Dimansa frowned, with confusion in her eyes, what computer? Chen Tao looked at Dimansa's confused look. Chen Tao smiled and said, let me take a look at it. Before that, put on your clothes. Clothing. Dimansa's eyes glowed with a glint, and she hummed. The two got dressed. Chen Tao looked at Dimansha. Dimansha was wearing a black bodysuit that perfectly outlined her proud figure. Timanza raised her hand, picked up her golden hair, and tied it up. After tying it up, Dimansa looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, have you not seen enough? Hearing this, Chen Tao was happy. He said with a smile, I haven't enjoyed it enough. Dimansa's fair face turned red. She rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, I'm dressed. Where's your computer now? Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, well, I'll take you to see it. As he said this, he walked to Dimansa. Dimansa looked at Chen Tao with big eyes. Chen Tao raised his hand and hugged Dimansa horizontally in his arms. Dim Ansa was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao. What are you going to do? Chen Tao smiled and said nothing. Suddenly, the surrounding environment changed suddenly. Dim Ansa came back to her senses and found that the surrounding environment had changed. She was slightly stunned and looked around. Her face changed drastically. What is this? Dim Ansa was in the vast universe. It was pitch black all around. Starlight could be seen in the distance. In front of Dim Ansa, a huge sphere exuded a blue luster. The sphere looked like a mechanical planet, very huge. Seeing the sphere in front of her, Dim Ansa could feel her own insignificance. Universe, I am in the universe. Dim Ansa looked at Chen Tao in horror. Chen Tao looked at Dim Ansa with a horrified face. He smiled and said, "Calm down, don't worry, I'm here." Dim Ansa was slightly startled, looking at the confident smile on Chen Tao's face. Dim Ansa slowly stabilized her emotions, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Is this in the universe? My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 367. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Yeah." Tai Manza looked down subconsciously, and she could see stars below. Realizing that she was in the universe, her eyes trembled slightly. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. She suddenly noticed a pair of pure white wings growing behind Chen Tao. The wings flapped to ensure that the two people's positions would not change. Wings, Fei looked at Chen Tao with his big eyes and said, "Are you an angel?" Angel. The pair of wings behind Chen Tao were programmed by Chen Tao using nebula. They are wings made of technology and are not owned by Chen Tao himself. Chen Tao looked at Dim Ansa's lustrous eyes. He smiled and said, "Angels are just myths. I am not an angel, I am just an ordinary human being with some high technology." Dim Ansa raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. She said, "Human beings do not have wings, and there is no way for human beings to stand in this universe without protection." Tai Manza said, "But you and I are both in this universe now. It stands to reason that when we are in the universe, the human body will be instantly frozen into popsicles, and in this vacuum, we should not be able to hear each other. Sound." She looked at Chen Tao. "If you are not an angel, there is only one possibility, you are a god. Only gods can achieve this level." Her moving eyes sparkled like those stars. Chen Tao never believed in God. He was born and raised in a slum, and he has seen people lose time and die in front of him. If there is a God, then how can God watch people die? Just looking at Dim Ansa's hopeful eyes, Chen Tao fell silent for a moment. He smiled and said, "Yes, I am God, the God of this universe." Her eyes lit up and she said, "Then, are you the one who saves us?" "Yes." Chen Tao smiled and said, "I am here to save you." There was a smile on Dim Ansa's face. "It's incredible, I have become a woman of God." Tai Manza also smiled. "Didn't you say before that you wanted to see my computer?" Computer. Dim Ansa came back to her senses and said, "Where is the computer?" Chen Tao said, "That's the one in front of you." Front. Dim Ansa looked forward. "Looking at this behemoth with blue light in front of me, looking at this behemoth as big as a planet." Dim Ansa was so shocked that her mouth opened slightly. She looked at Chen Tao in disbelief. "This is it?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "Well, that's it." Tai Manza blinked her eyes, smiled, and said, "It's such a big computer. What does this computer do?" She looked at Chen Tao curiously. Chen Tao said, "It has many functions. For example, using it can eliminate monsters and viruses on your planet." Dim Ansa was startled and looked at Chen Tao in disbelief. "Really?" Chen Tao said, "Yeah." Dim Ansa looked at Chen Tao. She slowly adjusted her posture, put her hands around Chen Tao's neck, and looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. She showed a playful smile and said, "I didn't believe it before, but I believe it now. Like this? If so, are you willing? Help us and save us." Chen Tao looked at Dimanche and smiled, do you still remember your previous promise? If I solve the monsters and viruses on your planet, then you will. Dimanche looked at Chen Tao, her eyes glowing with luster, the corners of her mouth raised slightly, and she said with a smile, my man is a god. I don't think there is anything that makes me, a woman, more glorious than this. What I said before, counted, I am sure. Chen Tao smiled, okay. He disappeared and took Dimanche back to the bedroom. Dimanche got down from Chen Tao's arms and looked at Chen Tao. The wings behind Chen Tao have disappeared. Seeing this, Dimanche withdrew her gaze. Her gaze fell on Chen Tao's face. She smiled and said, what are you going to do next? Chen Tao smiled and said, just do it, now. Dimanche looked at Chen Tao strangely, now. Yes, right now, Chen Tao said. Just at this moment. Time stops passing. Everything around turned into code blue. Dimanche followed Chen Tao and entered the other world. Dimanche looked at the blue codes around her. Her eyes trembled slightly, and then she looked at Chen Tao, this is it. Chen Tao said, the world is divided into two sides. One is the outer world, which is the world we live in, and the other is the inner world, which is what you see now. These codes are the codes that make up these worlds. As long as this code is changed, can change the world. He looked at Timantha, I can also erase something by deleting and erasing these codes. Timantha's expression became more solemn and she said, did you rely on it to erase the hearts of those light beasts before? Ye Chen Tao said with a smile, you are quite smart. Dimanche's eyebrows slightly stretched, and she said, that's right, I am the head of the law enforcement team, Dimanche. Chen Tao nodded slightly, then now as long as the codes that turn creatures into monsters and the code data of those monsters are erased from this planet, then the planet can be restored to its original state. What should we do? Dimanche looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao crossed his arms and said, this is a huge amount of data. It is a bit cumbersome to process. Just leave it to the computer. Nebula Chen Tao said, erase the monsters on this planet and the evil codes that can turn creatures into monsters. Received the order, searching. Nebula's mechanical voice sounded. Not much time passed, probably only 10 seconds. Search completed, erasing. Erasure completed. Hearing this, Chen Tao exited the inner world mode. Dimanche came back to her senses. She looked at the bedroom that had returned to its original state. He looked at Chen Tao and said, how is it? Chen Tao looked at Dimanche and smiled, done. Done. Dimanche was stunned, and there was a gleam in her pupils. The problem that has troubled the people of the entire Holy Land for half a century and made them despair for half a century was solved in less than a minute. Dimanche couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe it. Looking at Dimanche's expression, Chen Tao said, if you don't believe it, you can go outside the wall and take a look, and you will know. Dimanche looked at Chen Tao, her face full of disbelief and shock, and she seemed to be still a little dazed. After a while, Dimanche breathed a sigh of relief, and she looked at Chen Tao, I still find it hard to believe, I feel like I am in a dream now. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 368. Chen Tao looked at Dimanche in front of him, and he smiled, it is estimated that it will take some time for you to confirm. In this case, I will give you time. Dimanche looked at Chen Tao and said, indeed, for such a big thing, I do need to confirm, but I believe you. She looked at Chen Tao, since you said it has been solved, it must have been solved. After all, you are a god. Dimanche believes in Chen Tao, but her belief cannot change anything. She needs to look at this matter with other people's eyes. Only when others confirm it can it be completely confirmed. Dimanche smiled, approached Chen Tao, held Chen Tao's hand, looked at Chen Tao with big eyes, and said, my previous promise has not changed. I believe you have solved those things, so as a reward. She looked at Chen Tao, I will do whatever you want me to do. Hearing this, looking at Dimanche's moving blue eyes, his heart was warm. He raised his hand and fell on Dimanche's cheek. Dimanche's eyelashes trembled slightly, and the eyes under the eyelashes were covered with a thin layer of mist. Chen Tao leaned close to Dimansa's face and kissed her. Their lips parted. Chen Tao showed a naughty smile. Dimansa blushed and said, then, can I accompany you tonight? Chen Tao blinked and looked at Dimansa, tonight. What does that mean? Did she change her mind? Not going to fulfill her promise? Although Chen Tao didn't care that much, he still felt a little uncomfortable when he thought of Dimansa's resistance. Could it be that what she said before was all false? Dimansa nodded slightly, I want to tell everyone this news, the sooner the better. Chen Tao's heart moved, his eyebrows stretched slightly, and the corners of his mouth rose slightly. So that's it? Indeed, it would be best if this matter could be told to others as soon as possible. Dimansa had waited for so long, and those threats to humans finally disappeared. Knowing this, how could she hold back her joy and not tell others? Chen Tao smiled and said, okay, go ahead. Yeah, Dimanche nodded. She reluctantly let go of Chen Tao's hand, walked to the door, picked up the windbreaker hanging on the hanger, put on the windbreaker, looked back at Chen Tao, and said, I'm leaving. Chen Tao nodded slightly. Dimanche looked at Chen Tao deeply, turned around and walked out the door. Chen Tao looked at Dimanche's back, and he knew that the entire Holy Land would usher in an uproar next. The entire Holy Land has undergone earth-shaking changes in this uproar. Chen Tao didn't think much about it, and his figure disappeared on the spot. After Dimanche put on her clothes, she hurried to the command center and found Leslie, the commander. Dimanche told Leslie solemnly that the monsters and viruses had been solved. The monsters and viruses have been eliminated by Chen Tao. Leslie's old face was a little more horrified, and he looked at Dimanche in disbelief. There were many people in the headquarters, and they also heard what Dimanche was saying, and they all looked over here. Leslie looked a little bit unbelievable, and he said, how is it possible? Jenna, who was standing by, crossed her arms and looked at Dimanche, but she didn't say anything. Dimanche looked at Leslie and said, Chen Tao is a god. Leslie was startled and said, God. Dimanche nodded slightly and said, I saw the wings behind him. There is no god in this world, Jenna said, as a warrior, you should believe in science and technology, not in any gods and ghosts. When Dimanche heard this, she looked at Jenna and said, have you been to the universe? Jenna was slightly startled and frowned, does it matter whether I have been to the universe or not? Dimanche said lightly, yesterday I went to the universe once, and I entered the universe under his guidance. In that universe, I can see those huge planets and those stars. Beside him, I was not frozen by the coldness of the universe, and I could even speak in the vacuum. Jenna crossed her arms and said lightly, how can you be sure that you are not dreaming? Talking in the universe? How funny. Dimanche frowned. Okay, Leslie said, Dimanche has been busy collecting resources recently. I guess she is a little tired mentally, which is why she has such an illusion. Dimanche looked at Leslie and said, this is not an illusion. Dimanche looked at Leslie seriously and said, Commander, I hope you will allow me to take people out to investigate. Upon hearing this, Leslie stroked his sheep beard, looked at Dimanche, hesitated a little, and nodded slightly, this matter is of great importance. It is indeed necessary to confirm it. I will leave it to you. Dimanche's eyes lit up, she saluted to Leslie and said, yes. Dimanche walked away. Jenna looked at Dimanche's back, she also retracted her gaze, walked to Leslie, and said, then Commander, I will also withdraw first. Leslie nodded slightly. Jenna retracted her gaze and turned to leave. Leslie looked at Jenna's back as she left, he slowly retracted his gaze and fell into silence. On the other side, the matter of collecting food has been resolved. When Pai got up in the morning, she saw that Chen Tao was not around, so she put on her clothes and went to bring breakfast back to her room. When Pai arrived in the room, she saw Chen Tao lying on the bed, looking at the ceiling. Seeing Pai coming back, Chen Tao turned his head to look at Pai. He smiled and said, "Where have you been?" Pai picked up the plastic bag with breakfast in her hand, looked at Chen Tao, and said with a smile, "I went to change some breakfast." She sat on the edge of the bed and put the breakfast on the bedside table. Chen Tao saw Pai's back from this angle. She had just gone out, so she was wearing the clothes she had been wearing before, that black leather bodysuit, which perfectly outlined her enchanting figure. Her waist was slender and her shoulders were thin. Her long golden hair was tied up, revealing her white neck, which looked quite charming and cute. Looking at Pai's moving back, Chen Tao smiled. He stood up and approached Pai. Approaching her from behind, he put his arm around Pai's waist and got close to her. As soon as he got close, Chen Tao smelled her fragrance. Pai felt Chen Tao approaching, and her face turned slightly red. Chen Tao leaned over Pai's shoulder, leaned close to her ear, greedily smelled her unique body fragrance, and then said softly, "What breakfast?" He looked forward. There were 2 plastic boxes over there. Pai smiled and said, "Applesauce." She opened the plastic box and revealed the food inside. The white flesh and red peel were mixed together. This was exactly the breakfast made by beating apples into sauce. Seeing this breakfast, Chen Tao couldn't help but blink. This breakfast, is it too bleak? You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 369. However, on second thought, so is it? Here in the sanctuary, all resources are in short supply, so being able to eat this is already very good. Come to think of it, this applesauce is the so-called grain collected yesterday. Although it's just applesauce, it can indeed be used as food to stave off hunger. But for Chen Tao, this thing meant that he had no appetite at all. Breakfast was just applesauce. For Chen Tao, who was used to eating delicious food, it was unbearable. Suddenly, the woman in front of him stood up. Chen Tao looked at Pai, and Pai looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "I'm going to take a shower first." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Yes." Pai took small steps, untied the rope on her blonde hair, walked to the closet, found a piece of clothing, and then went into the bathroom on her own. Look at the closed bathroom door. Chen Tao looked away and looked at the applesauce on the table, his eyebrows slightly stretched. In the bathroom, Pai closed her eyes and felt the warm water falling on her body. What she was thinking about was Chen Tao's face. Although the man had only been here for 3 days, in these 3 days, he had completely occupied Pai's empty emotional space. Will there be children? Pai's face turned red. Pai shook his head, trying to get rid of this thought. She thought of what Chen Tao said before. Chen Tao said that he would be asked to help her liberate the sanctuary. Is this true or false? Pai was thinking, and she said, "It's better to ask him." After taking a shower, Pai put on her clothes and left the bathroom. As soon as Pai came out of the bathroom, he smelled a strong aroma. Pai was slightly startled, her eyes brightened slightly, and she looked at the source of the fragrance. I found a plate of beef placed on the cabinet. The beef was glowing with white mist and exuding a rich fragrance. Meat, Pai was startled. She looked at Chen Tao in disbelief. This is it? Chen Tao was sitting on the edge of the bed. When he saw Pai coming out, he smiled and said, "This is the breakfast I prepared. Come and try it." Pei looked at Chen Tao with big eyes. She hummed, walked to Chen Tao obediently, and slowly sat down beside Chen Tao. She looked at the steak in front of her. "What kind of meat is this?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "Beef, this is steak." Pei said, "Beef? I haven't eaten beef yet." Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. "Don't you raise cattle here?" When Pei heard this, she said, "It's good, but the quantity is very small. Those who can eat steak are noble people. Like me, I can't eat such a thing." Chen Tao put his arms around Pei's slender waist, looked at Pei, and said with a smile, "How about giving it a try?" Yes. Pei looked at the knives and forks placed on both sides of the plate of steak in front of her. She raised her hand and picked up the knives and forks. She looked at Chen Tao. "How do you use this?" Chen Tao smiled, "Come, I'll teach you." Chen Tao picked up the knife and fork, cut a piece of beef with ease, stuck it with a fork, and brought it to Pei's mouth. Pei was slightly startled. Looking at the red and tender beef pieces in front of her, she pursed her thin lips, opened her mouth slightly, and took a bite. As soon as she ate, Pei's eyes lit up slightly. She chewed slowly and tasted it carefully. After finishing the meal in one bite, Pei couldn't help but look at Chen Tao. "It's delicious, it tastes good. It's better than anything I've eaten in the sanctuary. Where did you get the steak?" Chen Tao smiled, "Eat more." Pei responded. Chen Tao fed Pei to eat. Pei's face turned slightly red and he seemed a little uncomfortable, but he still ate one bite after another obediently. She didn't forget to ask, "Where is this?" Chen Tao said with a smile, "This is taken from where I live. This was prepared by number 1 from base number 1, and then Chen Tao took it out from the wormhole." Pei's big eyes had a hint of luster. She looked at Chen Tao. "Where do you live? Where is that?" Before, Chen Tao confessed to Pei and admitted his alien identity, but didn't say much else. Now when he heard Chen Tao mention where he lived, Pei naturally became interested. Chen Tao smiled, "On a planet called Earth Star." Pei's eyes glowed, and she said, "Isn't it beautiful there?" Chen Do Xiao, "Well, not bad." Pei looked at Chen Tao and said, "Can you take me to see it?" Of course. Chen Tao smiled and said, "It's just a thought that I want to go there. As long as you want, we can go there at any time." Pei looked at the steak in front of him and said, "I really want to go out for a walk with you, but it's just about the sanctuary." Seeing Pei's somewhat depressed look, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Don't worry." Pei was slightly startled. She raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, "I went out in the morning and settled the matter by the way. From now on, people in the sanctuary can rest assured and live in this world without fear." Pei was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao with astonishment in her eyes. "What?" She couldn't believe it. Seeing the shock in Pei's clear eyes, Chen Tao smiled slightly and said, "Just like what you just heard, the holy domain has been liberated. It may take some time to change the laws of the holy domain, but I think it's only a matter of time that the laws of the sanctuary change with the liberation of the sanctuary." In addition, Chen Tao had approached Jenna and made a promise to Jenna. As long as the sanctuary confirmed that all viruses and monsters in the outside world had been eradicated, Jenna would naturally have to obey Chen Tao because of the bet. The head of the law enforcement team has to obey Chen Tao, so it is no longer difficult to change the laws of the sanctuary. Pei was a little unbelievable. Chen Tao just spent one morning changing the world that once plunged mankind into despair? How is this possible? Like many people who heard this, Pei also couldn't believe this fact. Pei looked at Chen Tao, with disbelief written all over his little face. Looking at Pei's expression, Chen Tao smiled. He said, I think your people will go out to confirm this matter during this period. If you don't believe it, just wait a few days and the matter will be resolved. Pei's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. She pursed her thin lips, and her eyes glowed with a trace of luster. Chen Tao held Pei's chin, raised her face, looked into her eyes, and said with a smile, "The Holy Land is liberated, how are you going to repay me?" Pei's eyes trembled slightly, with luster shining inside, and her face turned slightly red after a while. She rested her little head on Chen Tao's shoulder and said, "I will repay you how you want me to repay you." She raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "Is that okay? My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 370. Chen Tao looked at Pei beside him. Pei had just finished taking a shower. She was wearing a thin black lace gauze dress, which fit her graceful figure perfectly, and her waist was full. The hem of the skirt is very short, and the legs are long and straight. She was looking at Chen Tao with her big moving eyes, and her serious look was so cute. Chen Tao smiled, "Okay." He said with a smile, "Eat breakfast first and then talk after eating." "Yeah." Pei hummed. Chen Tao was planning to continue feeding Pei. "I'll do it," Pei Xiao said, "I also want to try using this kind of tableware." Seeing Pei's energetic look, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Yes." Pei took the knife and fork from Chen Tao's hand, then sat up straight and imitated Chen Tao's use of the knife and fork to handle steak. Although Pei has never used it, she has learned it after watching Chen Doki. She easily cut off a piece of beef and brought it to Chen Tao's mouth. She smiled and said, "Here." Chen Tao smiled, opened his mouth and took a bite. The beef is very tender, full of juice, and has a melt in your mouth feeling. When you take a bite, the aroma fills your mouth and it feels very good. Finished eating. Pei took another bite and handed it to Chen Tao. Pei's eyes shone slightly. She looked at Chen Tao with joy on her face. It seemed that feeding Chen Tao was more interesting than eating it herself. At such a close distance, I could smell the fragrance of Pei. Chen Tao's heart felt hot and he said, "You should eat some too." Pei hummed and said with a smile, "It's okay, I don't eat much." Open your mouth." Chen Tao took a bite. There was a smile on Pei's face. Seeing Pei's expression, Chen Tao smiled and stopped talking, eating breakfast quietly with her. Finished breakfast. Chen Tao put Pei on the bed. Pei looked at Chen Tao's face in front of her, and two blushes flew up on her face. "Tao." Chen Tao smiled, "I just finished breakfast, it's time for some exercise." Pei's face turned red, and she slowly closed her eyes as she watched Chen Tao getting closer and closer. Time passed by minute by minute. The reconnaissance team led by Timensa left the wall in the morning. By the evening of that day, Timanza's team is back. Timanza came to the headquarters and met Commander Leslie. Leslie was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, looking at the scenery outside. When he heard the sound of high heels behind him, he turned slightly sideways and looked at Timanza behind him. Demantha saluted Leslie. Leslie looked at Timantha and said, "How's it going?" Timanza stood up slowly, looked at Leslie, and said, "I led the team to inspect the three areas A, B, and C. Those three places were where thunder beasts gathered in the past, and this time we went there finally. I saw nothing, and no monsters were found, as if they had disappeared from the world." She looked at Leslie and said seriously, "It is almost impossible for there to be no monsters in areas A, B, and C at the same time. I have reason to believe that what Chen Tao said is true." Leslie shook his goatee with his skinny hand. He looked at Demantha with a solemn look on his face. "Indeed, there are no monsters in these three districts. It is incredible. It's just because there are no monsters in the three districts. It would be too childish to judge that it is safe outside." Timantha was slightly startled, and she looked at Leslie. Timanza said, I understand, please let me continue to search with the team tomorrow. Leslie said, yeah. Dimantha turned and left. Leslie looked at Timantha's back. He said nothing until Timantha's back disappeared from sight. Leslie turned slightly, put his hands behind his back, and looked at the scenery outside the floor-to-ceiling window. If the monster is gone and the virus is gone, then can I continue to exist as the commander of the sanctuary? Leslie's pupils glowed. Now that Jency is dead, if I can't even be the commander of the sanctuary, if my status as an official is gone, then what's the point of my life? The monster is dead and the virus is gone, Leslie said. I have been waiting for this news for too long. Without monsters and viruses, there is no need for the law of the sanctuary. Without the law of the sanctuary, I can follow the route of the law. Miss each other. But now. Leslie clenched his fists, gritted his teeth, and said, it's not necessary. Let the laws of the sanctuary remain and allow me to have the highest rights as the commander of the sanctuary. This is the best solution. Important. He clenched his fists. What's going on? Seeing Dimancha walking out with an ugly expression, Enching frowned and asked doubtfully. Timanza looked at Enching and said, the commander wants us to continue the investigation. Continue the investigation? Isn't it obvious? Enching looked at Dimancha and said, A, B, and C are major areas. There is not a single monster in these three places. Isn't this already explained? Is everything done? When the other resource group members heard this, they immediately became excited. Area is the area most severely affected by the virus. Not a single monster can be seen in that area, which is enough to explain everything. And that includes areas B and C. Commander, don't you want to believe this? What else does he want us to do? It's strange. We have been investigating for a full day, and we are absolutely sure. Commander, this is... There was a lot of discussion. Indeed. To be honest, Dimancha trusted Chen Tao, so when she was investigating, although she let the team go together at the beginning, she even let one person investigate one place directly later. Only then did she sweep all three areas within one day. After looking at these three areas, it can be basically confirmed that there are no monsters outside. But what Dimancha never expected was that the commander was still worried. This is too strange. Dimancha said, okay. As soon as she spoke, the surroundings fell silent. Dimancha said, I believe the commander also has the commander's ideas. The commander is cautious, and we should understand. Let's go out and investigate tomorrow and talk about it? Yes. Everyone responded. Dimancha said, pack up, take a day off tonight, and gather here at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Yes. Dimancha turned and left. To be honest, Dimancha was also confused. It's obviously like this. Why does the commander still plan to continue investigating? Could it be, Dimancha has a bad premonition? Does the commander not intend to liberate the sanctuary? Impossible. Dimancha shook her head, shaking off this somewhat scary thought. It is impossible for the commander not to intend to liberate the sanctuary. This is impossible. Dimancha firmly believed in this idea. She had seen everything Commander Leslie had done. The commander had always been working hard for the survival of mankind. Although the rules of the sanctuary made Dimancha somewhat disgusted, it was understandable for the survival of mankind. It would be strange to say that the commander did not want to liberate the sanctuary now. Let's investigate again tomorrow.